I've got some notes here. I'm based out of Dublin, Ireland, so it's 9 o'clock at night in my brain. So excuse me if I look at my iPad every so often just to remember where I am, but you guys know the drill. Cool, look, the gist of who I am is pretty well captured up here. My name is David Kennefick. I'm the Global Engineering Principal at EdgeCan. Previous to that, I was a pen tester, a product architect, a solutions engineer, and I was a technical account manager, and all those things that the outward thinking, outward speaking people end up being in small organizations as you scale and grow. So Global Engineering Principal is what I do now, and one of the most rewarding jobs I've ever had, but not going to talk too much about EdgeCan, try my best not to anyway. I did start in a bank doing anti-money laundering. Super interesting. Brandon beforehand spoke a little bit about some of that. It is so interesting, such a cool world that, but alas, I left it behind. I've got some degrees and things like that. Sometimes they're really, really important for people. Don't care about them much anymore. What are we here to talk about today? We're here to talk about crawling. Crawling in many languages means many different things. The context we're going to talk about crawling today is really crawling as a process in vulnerability scanning. And it's not web scraping, it's not enumerating domains, although we'll touch on that a little bit because crawling the internet is crawling the internet. Doesn't matter if you're sending HTTP requests or DNS requests, it's still crawling in some shape or form. So we'll touch on where they intersect. Crawling has many different names: crawling, spidering, walking the links, really common ways of looking at it. It works really well today, but there are challenges, and throughout this I'm going to talk about some of the common challenges nowadays, especially in the context of APIs. APIs are, you can't really crawl APIs. You can just kind of throw rocks at it until it gives you a good response back. It's not easy. Same with single page applications. Brandon touched on that as well. I was so happy with that. He touched on if you don't scroll down on a web page, does that web page even exist? Like that type of stuff, the way dynamic content is generated nowadays, which brings me on some of the considerations here. Static and dynamic, really important. Static content is really easy to find and discover and enumerate and explore and test and record against. Dynamic content, not so much at all, and we'll touch through that as we go. What is the advice for best efforts at crawling? Use a human, get a human involved. Get a human involved somewhere. It doesn't matter, just somewhere. And eventually we can get AI involved. We will talk a bit more about that, but use a human. And works even better when you get the human that created the technology involved. So there's a little bit I'll talk about the kind of the general journey of a piece of tech before it gets to production. And everybody focuses on, let's get the devs to secure their stuff better. And that's cool, that's great, it's a great idea, it's wonderful. So many technical controls we can implement there are really gonna help in the grand scheme of things, especially in the longer term. But all the juicy findings come from manipulating the user experience and doing something that the developer didn't really take into account when they were designing it. So were they designing it? Were they just building it to someone else's spec? We come along with some of those questions as well as we go. As well as the future outlook. Some really, really slick things I've seen in the last few months now, since Mark Weatherford had such an insightful session this morning. I don't know if anybody saw it, where he talked about, does everybody remember where they were on the 30th of November 2022? And a lot of people will, because that was the day that ChatGPT came public. And it's so interesting because he's so right, and it's just so insightful that he eloquently put, way better than me. But since then, I've seen some really, really slick things, like Pentest GBT and all these type of things. It's a Clippy for pen testing is the best one I've seen, and it's so cool. But we'll talk about that. Predictive endpoint enumeration. And then that feeds into a little bit of just use our standard crawling template. What does that mean? And it's such an eye-opener, I suppose, when we start scratching that surface. Getting AI to do this for us and distill the interesting parts. These are the things that we're seeing now. We can actually start using this type of technology to multiply our capabilities when it comes to crawling, figuring out what's on a web page, figuring out what's meant to be on a web page, figuring out the context associated with this data. And yeah, we'll touch a bit more on that. There's something that I've thought about a lot over the last few years in particular, and I did a UX UI project a couple of years ago, and it really got me thinking a little differently on how some of this works. And so much of the world still lives in the request response client server world, and that's, which is fine. It's fine. We're still in that world technically, and I don't think we'll ever disappear from it anytime soon. We're just going to add extra steps. And so there's an idea I've been mulling around on: discover, render, explore, instead of just the client response, client server, these type of things. But we'll touch on that a little bit as well. I've got an acronym library in here. I apologize, but I feel like it's better than just scraping a Wikipedia page to get this type of information. I'll skip past it really quickly, but at some points I'm going to probably say some sort of acronyms, and we can, at least you can have them and see them, and anybody can get a copy of this slide, these slides afterwards, but yes, as we go. Cool, moving on. This is a decade of crawling wrapped up, and I'm a little bit of a cynic, I suppose, when it comes to this as well, because I've actually got a category at the bottom here: pre-commoditization and then commoditization, because it's an important thing to consider when you're talking to security vendors and how they're doing things and things like that. So, and this is like not as good as some other people's timelines that have been presented already at this show, but we'll leave that aside for the minute. Introduction of the web as we know it. Late 90s, early adapters, the likes of Nessus, Nikto, all begins at that. And then I'll reference Burp Suite a lot. Burp Suite is so slick. Everybody should be using it in some shape or form. Do a little course, figure out how to use it. It'll just help you understand some of the fundamentals of how the internet works. OWASP as well, and then there are a lot of early adapters. Metasploit as well, great piece of tech. Then we moved into the 2010s, and we get towards APIs start to come alive a bit. Then we've got people talking more about cloud migrations, digital transformations, even earlier than that, but I think everyone started thinking about that. Then complex business logic started to be introduced. You had forms that had 8 steps to go from A to Z on them. Like it's insane. But then we get into late 2010s, CI/CD, automated security. This is what I'd kind of dub as the faux AI-based world. People are like, oh yeah, we use AI. Does everyone remember like 5 or 6 years ago, everyone was like, yeah, we use AI for this. It's like, we all know that they actually didn't. And we all know now that they most certainly didn't, because we've used AI. At least everybody here has probably used it a little bit at least. And then we get into the early 2020s, and we're still in the early 2020s. So we've got AI-based here, and this is genuine AI-based, and this is when it really starts to open up. And the only way I could kind of capture that in a single half sentence is Gen AI enabled the everyman to scale. And that's what it's allowed me to do in so many of the tasks I carry about in my everyday life, my home, my life admin, but not only that, my work admin as well. So there's a lot of interesting pieces here. So I've always felt that crawling was the ugly stepsister of scanning. Everybody focused on scanning, scanning, scanning. And that's great, but what are you scanning? Scanning is like, as the talk is titled here, scanning is easy, crawling is the hard part. Why is that? Because finding stuff to run scans against is difficult. Finding it consistently is even more difficult. So we'll touch on that. And I'm going to break out into a couple of different parts here. One thing that just keep in your heads throughout the next kind of 20 minutes, I'm going to cover off web applications, then APIs, and single-page applications, and then what they look like in the next couple of years, give or take. But just keep in your head that from this, it all starts with the people who are using the tech. And if this is individual people, this is groups, this is organizations, this is devs, security folks, and will be AI eventually that's using it. They are the ones that inform the buyers. So when it comes to actually buying security technology, specialization, you need to make sure that you know what you're getting. You need to make sure you focus on asking the hard questions, such as, what's this like when it comes to crawling? How does this crawl compared to its competitors? Does it use a headless browser? How deep does it go when it comes to, you need to really focus on these questions, because some of the stuff that vendors are getting away with now makes you sick. Well, it makes me sick. I don't know about you guys, but I'm sick to my teeth. That's the cynicism in me. Cool, so moving in towards some of the web applications. I'm loving the little icons, by the way. They provided everybody with these icons. I didn't come up with this, they did. It's glorious, it's beautiful, I love it. So web applications, and how do web applications work in general? So everybody's seen some sort of variation of this. And this is one that's stuck in, this is in my mind. I tried to translate it in some sort of Miro. But the way I think about it is you have a user at the top, then you've got an orchestrator, then you've got a crawler, then you've got a scanner. And these are the different things that it does throughout the day, I suppose, our particular job. So you start off, and I've got versions of this for APIs. I've got versions of this for single-page applications as well. Naturally, they get slightly more complicated as they go, but I've tried to keep it really as simple as possible here. So you start off with your scanning. You can change the scope, you can add to the scope, you can just start off with something simple at the start, and you define that, and then you start crawling on it. Then you start exploring it. Your crawler feeds back into your orchestrator and says, oh, we started crawling, we found a couple of things, it should be interesting as we go. We keep going, we add new things to the scope, and then in our gate here, all content discovered. And this is a bit of a hot topic for a lot of organizations, a lot of people in general. It's all content discovered. That's just all content you could discover. But ultimately, that's all we got to work with for the minute. So we're going to say all content discovered. And then the crawl is complete, and then it sends it back to me and says, do you want me to start scanning now? I found everything, and I start scanning. So that's really it. That's how crawling and scanning work together when it comes to traditional web applications. So that's, yeah, really straightforward. But the elephant in the room here, was all content discovered? No, it wasn't. It wasn't, because most people are happy when about 80%. 80% is pretty good. It's pretty good if you find 80%. And that doesn't even get into if you're looking at templated pages. What happens if you have a website that has 1 million pages? Are you going to crawl all of them? Probably not. You're going to go pretty 2 or 3 deep. You're going to start finding templating, like you have /author, /blog/date. Are you going to go through 100,000 related to these 30 people? Or are you just going to go, okay, look, they all look the same across the board. Let's pick a sample size. Probably the smart way to do it. Ideally, 95% coverage is great. If you can get 95% coverage, anywhere between 80 and 100 is like really good. It's really, really good. It also, a little bit of what I said at the start is, if you can get the actual person who created or maintained the tech that you're crawling on, they can say, you're missing all these. You don't have these, or this doesn't match my records. It's a super way to kind of elevate your capabilities here. And I'm going to keep repeating this over and over and over. You need a dedicated crawler for single-page application work. So single-page application, I think the first time I ever saw it was on an Apple site. When I was like scrolling down, I was like, oh my God, this is like a graceful experience. And it's leveled up and changed everything when it comes to web applications. We'll touch on that one separately. There's a lot in that one, so I'm not going to dig too much in it. For web crawling, the goal of web crawling in general, web crawling to find everything is a good idea. Web crawling just to immediately be followed by a scan is probably not the way. As in, you need to think of how you can use this data as well. It's useful information. Brand, I'm going to keep talking about branding because you talked a lot of things that I'm talking about here. But there's a lot of overlap in asset discovery, EASM, all of these type of technologies, and crawling. And people who are only using crawling data for the purpose of scanning are missing out on a wealth of information that you can pump into some big data system somewhere that can start giving you some really useful information. So it's super, super interesting data. I digress a bit. I'll ramble a little bit. Yeah, it's late in my brain. Challenges and advantages. Oh, this is a big one. Authenticated crawling and authenticated scanning. There's a lot in here, and I've made a lot of mistakes in my time, and I'll talk a little bit about some of them because some of them are I'm embarrassed about some of them now. But look, we'll talk about them. At least somebody will hopefully learn something. Authenticated crawling is just as important as authenticated scanning, because authenticated scanning is great, it's important, it provides more depth, it allows you to look at a piece of tech deeper down as an authenticated user would look, so you get more rigor and all of that adds to it. Same with crawling though. There's no point just scanning authenticated, you need to crawl authenticated as well. And now there's challenges, there's fierce challenges here because you have credentials management, lockout, privacy issues. What happens if I'm crawling on a medical site and all of a sudden I can see everybody's data? Like there's simple things like that. Session management, that's a technical problem. And there's big problems there, especially in the API space related to OT or single-use tokens and things like that for APIs. So I'll touch on that a little bit. Lots of things I'm going to touch on. Complex workflows. Brandon said earlier that you have steps 1 to 27 if you want to go set up a bank account and go and buy something. It's like 27 steps. Yeah, you can automate that. But it's really, really difficult, especially when something changes somewhere and all of a sudden you're 16 hours deep trying to get your single workflow to automate again and to work. And it's you can't Selenium and Cypress script your way out of all these things because you're going to have a couple of thousand of these in a few months' time, and all of a sudden it's untenable. Repeatability. I should have put predictability in here as well, but repeatability is so important. You need to be able to consistently go through these type of things and know what good looks like. Because once you know what good looks like, you can then infer based on that what bad looks like. You're like, wait, something's changed here. This isn't good. Let's investigate this. So it needs to be repeatable, but it can't just flake out. It needs to be good all the time. Maintenance, software maintenance, if it takes you 100 grand to make something, it's about 8%, give or take, 8 to 15% year on year to maintain it. So just think of it like that comes in. It doesn't matter if you're writing code or you're creating a workflow in a SOAR tool. That maintenance still exists. It still exists, so just don't forget that. Coverage, we'll talk loads about that. There are advantages. More realistic testing, and that's super important. You need testing to be as close to the user experience as possible because that's the best way to manipulate the user experience. Business logic flaws. Business logic flaws are kind of, there's a lot in that. That's a section in itself. So we'll talk a little bit about it as we go. Authentication. If you only test something unauthenticated and then all of a sudden you're able to access pieces of functionality that you should only be able to access authenticated, how do you tell the difference? You need to know what good looks like. So you need to be able to do a full crawl unauthenticated, a full crawl authenticated, the difference. And you need to be able to figure out and focus in on, wait, why is there overlap in these two places? I should only be able to access when I'm allowed. Validation of existing controls. We see a lot of people nowadays, it's super interesting, and everyone approaches it slightly differently. But if you do a vulnerability scan in January, and then you buy a WAF and you turn it on in February, and then you train the WAF and you get it to be super smart, we'll say. By April or 6 months later, give or take, you should be able to turn off the WAF and turn it on pretty quickly for vulnerability scanning and vulnerability testing. Because not only does it allow the testers to actually look at your tech and find underlying vulnerabilities in it, but it allows you to keep your WAF vendor honest. So there's lots of advantages to that as well. So everybody should try to do that if you can. Better reporting. Yeah, PCI. Anybody here have mandated to do the PCI dance every few days? Okay, we got at least one, yeah. Doesn't require you to do authenticated scanning. Yeah, if you self-registration on a particular piece of tech, sometimes you fall into scope where you have to do authenticated scanning. It's insane, but look, it's tax in the security industry. No, I like it except for the CVSS scoring, but it's a different thing. Coverage, privacy testing, role-based testing. Yeah, look, as in it's, I'll share this with everybody afterwards, and as well as my deep ramblings in the notes section, because everybody's going to agree in some shape or form with some of the stuff here, and it's ultimately boils down to depth, rigor, and or mostly or accuracy. We try to focus on accuracy a lot. So, yeah, okay, I forgot about this part, god damn it, okay. So, there's 3 particular stories I'm going to tell throughout the day. The first one, I might munch them up a little bit, but the first one was related to an application I was scanning and crawling in about 2013. It was for a bank, and I found basically they had put enabled, right? They had put enabled on it, so on the server. So I was like, okay, well, look, it's on the pre-prod server here. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Let's see if we can fiddle with the login page, and I replaced the login page with a U1 and iPad, right? And then one of the managers in there said, look, we need to make sure this doesn't exist on production. Can you try that? And I was like, it's probably not a good idea. And so like, just can you try it anyway? So yeah, we'll try it. Can you email me over and ask me to try it? Yeah, thanks, yeah, cool. CYA, as you guys say in the States. So emailed it over and replaced the main login page for this mobile, or for this banking application with a U1 and iPad, click here. I was like, frantically going through my logs, trying to find the original request to that page so I could replace it and send it back in. And I was like, okay, I think nope, have not fixed it. This is a disaster. Oh, it was an absolute nightmare. But yeah, crawling is a cruel mistress, as they say. I've added in some, these are web application locations, right? So I went through we do a stats report every year, and there's some really funky data we get out of it, right? Some really interesting data, but some data that kind of persists through any geographical location. Check these locations in your organization, because you're going to have probably at least one of them, and at least one of them is going to have a vulnerability. So it's pretty interesting. And they're not going to be like, oh, you got a misconfiguration here, and you got to change this, and you got verbose logging enabled. We're going to put that in as a medium risk vulnerability. It's no. You're going to find some super sexy vulnerabilities here. So yeah, it's going to be good. So I've tried to put in some interesting ones for each of, this is web applications, and we're just about wrapping web applications up, and we move on to APIs, but I tried to pull out web applications, APIs, and single page applications. Single page applications are much harder. We'll talk through that in a couple of minutes. Moving into API-based applications. I've worded that weirdly, you might know, but API-based applications, application programming interface, application programmable interface, lots of different ways of looking at it. I just look at them as APIs that are also applications. And we'll talk about mobile wrappers and things like that in a couple of minutes. How an API-based web crawl works. Right. So virtually the exact same. You could do it the exact same way as you do it with a web application. In fact, most people do, and they come back with clean bills of health, and nobody worries about it. And then we're like, yeah, this is fine. No, 0 vulnerabilities. No, as soon as you start scratching that surface, you're in for a world of pain. Scan this. That's where we started last time, so that's where we'll start this time. So scan this. So I've got a little, the gate up here as provide documentation. Any sort of API scanning, you need to provide documentation. And it doesn't matter what people say. You are banging your face against the wall trying to test an API properly without documentation. And it goes back to a little bit of you need to know what good looks like, but we'll talk about that as we go. So usually people talk about Swagger files. Swagger files are perfect, great, love them. OpenAI formats, I think we're meant to call them that now. And environment files, super important, because that starts giving you information related to the Swagger file. APIs usually support more than one different location, one different organization, so the environment files are super handy as well, especially if you can get it filled in with parameters that are good and test parameters. That really helps. Then you send to the crawler, build these API requests and responses for me. Send them to the server and see if you get 200s back, and then I will tweak them until you get 200s back. So then you start exploring it. You start building it as it goes, and then eventually you get to the point where you're getting HTTP 200s from everything. That's great. That's really where you want to be. It's a good spot. It's a good spot. A little piece up here. So this one. I don't know if you can read it, but brute forcing. Everybody asks this, as in, like, can you not just brute force all the endpoints? As in, I don't know what sort of quantum world you're living in, but no, you cannot do that. You can try, but you're just going to waste an awful lot of time and electricity trying to do that. So always start the 400-meter race on the 200-meter line by asking for documentation. So super important. Cool. So as we get towards the end here, we've built everything. We've enumerated all of the API interactions. We've explored the scope. We've added more things to scope. We're building as we go with it. Is the build complete? Yes, the build is complete. Cool. Scan. And then we kick off a scan. And that is all the stuff that should be happening before you actually start the scanning part for vulnerability scanning on an API. And I don't know if it's user experience or something like that where all this gets hidden, or it's just people not wanting to acknowledge that these steps are really difficult and chances are they're not going to work out of the box and you're going to have to put some time in to make them work in the long term. So people want to avoid that as well, especially vendors. And we'll talk about that consistently throughout the day. So yeah, the complexities of different API styles. I do need my notes for this bit because there's a particular piece here and I want to tell it correctly because I couldn't really articulate it well and I found a way to articulate it well, so I had to write it down. So I'm definitely not going to be able to do it on the fly. But RESTful APIs, most common, always ask for machine-readable documentation. GraphQL, becoming more common. Graph in general is becoming a lot more common. Thanks, Facebook. You cannot crawl GraphQL without introspection enabled. So you need to be able to go and say, hey, how do I interact with this? And then it tells you, oh, well, you need to hit this endpoint, but you need these 8 tokens. And that's the way it responds. Mobile wrappers. Yeah, well, there's a whole talk in that alone. Mobile wrappers and how the whole world is moving away from native mobile applications to a mobile wrapper that's just an API with a little bit of JavaScript and a single page application in it, and that's what you're scrolling on, that's what you're looking on. It's just calling the exact same API that the website is using. So we'll touch on that, but each one has different complexities associated with it. So each one has different complexities. So there's a bit in it, and this is the bit that I do want to refer to my notes as. So web applications are designed to be interacted with by humans in a browser. APIs are designed to be interacted by machines in the air, in the ether, across electricity. Humans need a UI, machines don't. They just need to know what resources they should be interacting with. Ideally, open API, Swagger formats, understanding what good interactions look like is really important, because then you need to understand what bad, you can understand what bad looks like. And I'm going to keep reiterating that as we go. If you have an API that goes from step 1 to 5, how do you ensure the crawler gets past step 1? That's a great question. I wish someone knew the answer to it. That's like half the time you're talking to people about this and they're like, we have no idea how this gets from step 1 to step 5. Probably doesn't. Probably doesn't. Just like, that's it. There's a lot more in this, but there's a little, and I'm kind of a little bit pressed for time here. But there's a little bit on introducing. So if you have API documentation, why shouldn't you not have Figma documentation as well? If you need to understand how the technology, how the user's interacting with the technology, how they can interact with it, why shouldn't you get Figma technology as well? Bypass the developer, go straight and say, cool, can I get a Figma for this so I can understand the experiences that we're meant to be testing here? Like, that's how people should probably be thinking, and probably will be thinking in a few years. But things like scoping is really difficult. I think I have this written down at least once. But scoping's really difficult, and getting documentation is really difficult. So as soon as we start getting into a world where where documentation is readily available and Figmas are readily available, all of a sudden you can use human resources a lot less, because you won't be sitting down trying to scratch your head, figure out how stuff's meant to work. You'll have that presented to you before you start testing on it. So yeah, just there's so much in all of this here. I'm just going to have to skip past it because I don't have time for it. It's crazy. Authenticated testing and API-based applications. Testing versus an API. It's easy if you know what good looks like. Exactly. JWT tokens, and actually I'm going to go cert-based authentication as well. Cert-based cert pinning on mobile devices. Oh, what a nightmare to get around. JWT tokens. There's an interesting piece about JWT tokens and authenticated testing on an API, because if you send one request to a server and you say, authenticate me, please, and it says, okay, cool, and it sends you off to Okta or something, and it says you can use this token to interact with this API, but it's only valid for one request. If you're doing vulnerability scanning and you have 10 requests, and each of those 10 requests have 10 parameters, that's 100 things that you need to enumerate. And if you have 2,000 tests for each of these, all of a sudden you're in the hundreds of thousands of tokens that you need to go get and expire from this third party that's authenticating you. And all of a sudden you're into the close to 1 million requests from start to finish in order to test a very small API authenticated. And it's just be wary of that, because if you're paying per token, you're going to get a hefty bill. So just be wary of how that works. Offer your testers a token that lasts for 24 hours, if possible. I know that's not ideal. And then ask them to test the independent piece manually. Just say, hey, can you do this one a few times? You're going to have single-use tokens, by the way, so just do this. It makes it easier. But you have fierce costs associated with this. Lessons in APIs. There's a few on APIs. The first one is very simply the mistake I made, where what I waxed lyrically about earlier, where I just stuck a scanner on something and I was like, yeah, this is fine. It's probably going to be fine. Not going to worry about it. Yeah, clean bill of health. Loads of vulnerabilities. I just didn't test it properly, and this was me being lazy. And this is about 8 or 9 years ago now at this stage, but I was doing that 8 or 9 years ago. I learned my lesson. And I still see people do this every, I'd say, month, at least once a month. People are pointing just a raw vulnerability scanner with a crawler associated with it against an API and saying, yeah, good results, really nice work, team, well done. And I'd say most of us have done it in some shape or form, and just please don't do it. It's easier not to do it. Vulnerabilities exist on these locations. They exist, and you're going to find them. It was interesting when I done some of the kind of the data mining API/GraphQL, the amount of vulnerabilities that exist there, which kind of makes sense given the way GraphQL is architected. But this is a common submission/comment. Fierce amount of vulnerabilities there. It's amazing. Cool. moving into single page applications, I need to blast through the last 10 minutes here. I spent way too long on boring web applications. I'm sorry about that, but let's get through single page applications here. Single page applications, what does this look like? You can provide documentation for single page applications, right? How the event handlers work and the XHRs work, they are documented. Someone's documented them. So it's possible for you to then take that data and show a scanning engine what good looks like. So really difficult. So the only major change here is in the little green in the middle, we've got a little headless browser because we need to enumerate things. We need to pretend like we're an actual person when we're looking at a piece of tech and going, oh yeah, look, as in I'm an actual human scrolling here, look at me. So you start with your crawl and your build, then you explore. You explore the scope, you explore the resources that are available, and you interact with them like you're a human. And there's, yeah, last reference to Brandon earlier. But if a event handler exists on a web page and nobody's looking at it, does it really exist? That's just a good way to think about it. So all content discovered, definitely not. But look, we won't dig too much into that one for the minute. Single page applications, headless browsers, and enumerating the user experience is really, really difficult. And the intersection between developers, so I talked a little bit about this, user designer talks to users, user says, yeah, we want this, this, and this, we want it from step 1 to step 4 here. Designer maps it all out in Figma, hands it over to the developer and says, cool, can you build this for us? Cool, this is great, thank you very much. Security comes in and says, cool, can we test some of this? And yeah, you can, and you can figure out technical controls, but you're not going to figure out some of the really juicy stuff. So the juicy findings get introduced in that intersection of user experience design and development, I think is a good way. And that's where actually innovation, I think a lot of the innovation is kind of coming from the collaboration that happens between developers and user experience teams. It's not, the innovation is a rough word, but when you ask developers and UX designers to solve a problem, it usually comes in with a new piece of technology or a new workflow or a new way of adapting something that exists already to solve a problem. And that's just as simple as I got in explaining what innovation is. But a lot of the time you'll find once you start scratching that surface, it's dev and UX is where it comes from. There's an absolute horse amount of information in how does authentication work here. And I'm going to skip past a little bit of it because there's a good story associated with this. And scoping is hard. How do you scope out required components? Do you have permission to load these resources? These are all questions that I'm asking as a headless browser loading up a resource in a page. Do I have permission to load these resources? Where are all these third-party tokens coming from? Why am I being asked to use this resource here on handlebars.js? It's hosted in a weird place. I don't know. Should I be loading this up? These are interesting scenarios that we've seen in the real world. And I'll intersect this a little bit with in 2018, late 2018, I was doing about a couple of thousand web application scans for a big organization. And we were doing single page application, headless browsers, that type of stuff as well. Turns out we weren't loading out of scope resources. So when you're scrolling down on the site, Google was putting information in, Facebook was putting information in as well, and building out the site, building out the experience so people could pay using a card stored in Google, or they could tell their mates that they were going to see this as well via Facebook. So all of that was quite interesting, and turns out we weren't loading in any of those resources. So we presented a bit of a fire, someone got SQLI'd, and we were trying to replicate it. So we had all the logs, we had everything on it, we were trying to replicate it, and we were like, oh, what's going on here? We can't replicate it. Turns out we could only replicate it when you were on this particular site. You could only replicate it if you were authenticated to Google. And then you could only also replicate it if you were authenticated to Facebook. It was slightly different. It was a real planets align thing, and it kind of got me questioning loads of who owns the session. If it's a single page application and you're loading in resources from different locations, who owns the session? there's a lot in that, but it was interesting enough. Yeah, my vulnerabilities are your vulnerabilities. Thanks, Facebook. Last section here, artificial intelligence and application crawling. I've seen some really cool stuff here, and I'm going to blast through the last few sections here. But Gen AI for browser-based crawling. Gen AI, it's not AI. It's not AI yet, not until it can make me toast properly. But Gen AI, you can use so many different things, so many cool things here. I was very lucky. My mother explained to me when I was a child that a robot cannot understand the difference between an inference and an assumption. And I've always thought about it, and now it's so relevant with AI, like, as in how does it know? How does it know? Does it assume? No, based on these data points, it's figured it out. That's the inference here. Whereas me, I'm just like, I see that. I know the way to go. It's the assumption. Gen AI and brute forcing, you can pull out every single word on a page, and you can use frequency ML style analysis, and you can say, okay, well, based on that, I'm going to check left and right of the address for enumerating a subdomain or enumerating a directory on the site. Oh, it's so powerful. It's so exciting, some of this stuff. Like, it genuinely energizes me, some of it. Historical data, I've done 100,000 assessments in my life. Of those 100,000 assessments, all that data is stored. I can now say, hey, ChatGPT, or its equivalent, tell me where I'm most likely to find vulnerabilities. I have all these new things. Just tell me where I should spend my time. It's going to be an absolute game changer for some of this. And then intersection of discovery and crawling is super important. Discovery is like an active way of going out and finding what exists on the internet associated with an organization. Crawling is really beelining and focusing on a specific asset or application that exists. So it's like a Tiber exercise. It's in the acronyms. Adding out-of-scope components, super important. Adding out-of-scope sites, probably even more important. It's just you need to be really tight on scope. Scoping is hard. Crawling data fed into, you need to prove scoping. If you want to add something to scope, you need to gather the evidence to say why you should add it into scope. Yeah, just some people don't know that. Crawling data fed into asset management. I talked about it a little earlier, super important. Feed all crawling information into an asset management tool. I've got like 3 minutes here, so what I'm going to do, I want to get to my summary. Gen AI has changed a lot in a short amount of time. It really has. Predictive crawling, data-driven crawling, breach-based crawling. These guys got hit by this. Look for that anywhere that we have, and that's why I presented some of the kind of dodgy locations. Clippy for pen testing. There's a whole thing in this. I've seen so many exciting things. I sit down to do a 4-day pen testing engagement. I have a couple of AI that have been running over the last few weeks, and I sit down and I go, hey, AI, where should I be focusing my attention here? Oh, David, if you aim for this location and put 15 minutes into it, there's an 80% chance you'll find a critical risk vulnerability. Super interesting stuff. And then just our summary. So advanced techniques for, there's a lot. There's a summary here of things and good strategies that everybody should look at. I'll provide these slides to everybody. Use a headless browser where possible. Humans still play a part, and they're still going to play a part for the next decade at least, probably 8 decades, we don't really know. Keep your scope configuration really loose, bring everything in, and then decide what gets actually included in active scanning. 5 takeaways and conclusions. But the 5 takeaways really are just secure the UX, and you can secure the step before developers. A lot of people don't really think like that, so it's a super important component, and I think people really need to start thinking more like that. Auditing your crawls should be a risk management exercise, not a security person's decision during the initial monthly vulnerability scan. Always ask exactly what will be included in scope. What are you going to test? How are you going to test? Give me a list of things you're going to include in testing. All of that. Discovery is just crawling with extra steps. Yeah, crawling goes to the right, discovery goes to the left. That might be a nice way of saying it. And then AI will be a force multiplier for good and evil. It's already a force multiplier. It's a year old now. Gen AI, ChatGPT. It's a year old, and everybody's talking about it. Everybody's using it. It's insane. It's really exciting. Look, that's all I got. I've linked to our stats report as well. It is pretty good, actually. It aligns with like the DBIOR and things like that. So we're not crazy when we make these crazy, we say these crazy things. We got the stats to back it up. So it's most of my good stats are taken from our DBIOR report. So cool. Look, thank you very much, everyone. So yeah, any questions, please fire away. Shoot. Yeah. Okay, the question just for everybody, in my slides about the workflow of setting up a crawl, there's an audit. You audit your crawl. You look at your crawl. You see what things you want to send to the scanner. Is that recursive? Yeah, everybody. It's really a kind of, that's the way I see it, but I could probably pick out 10 pen testers and they'd say, no, this is an automated function. And I'm like, no, I like doing it manually because it allows me a bit more control. But yeah, there's a perfect use case to do that. Yes, you should probably do that, actually. You're probably right. Yeah, cool. Any other questions? Cool. Look, anybody wants a copy, you can come find me, or david@edgecan.com, and I'll send over to everyone who wants it. You've also got a ridiculous amount of ramblings as well in the notes section. So yeah, there's a lot in it, but thank you very much for your time, everyone. Really appreciate it. Take care.